Yeah, can you move forward a little bit? My little question is just sort of honestly. I don't know what to, just because the context I'm looking at right now, bureaucratic context inside. And I think one of the joyous things about, say, being a management consultant, you talk about one of the big management consultancies in the design firm, like yourself, is certainly you oversee clients, but for the most part, you're brought in when, at least at a reasonably high management level, they're ready. They want to do something on point. And you open yourself up, we know we need to change, we need help. They even admit that they're ready. They're at the point, psychologically, like where they admit they need external help to do things differently as well as innovate or whatever. I'm in the context right now where basically I'm trying to get them to understand that they can do things differently is the hard part. And that's my insurrection campaign, if you like. I don't know whether you've got any strategies or tactics about that, or whether you just...
Well, look, that's a counterpoint to the question that I was going to ask you, which is that you talked a lot about being in a not great bureaucracy, and I guess my question was, what are the strategies that you're using to break a not great bureaucracy?
Aside from thinking about running away and setting up my own
organization.
organization.
Exactly. Which is, but you know, I think it's really interesting because I think the question that I had, and one of the things that we've used, but I'd be curious is that, while people may or may not be open to newness, or for that matter, open to design, one of the things that actually we found, even in a highly bureaucratic organization, is that it's awakened they're open to the idea of a mission. There's actually a goal of that organization. And I think often, as designers, we're not that great at aligning what we're doing with what the mission of the organization is, that it actually, in fact, the internal understanding is more as important as the external understanding. And so, one of the things that we do a lot when we want to break into highly bureaucratic contexts is try to understand what the mission is and figure out how we can actually align what we're doing with the kind of real reason that actually people are often engaged with the work that they're doing. So that's one thing, and then I'm just curious what you're doing.
I think the piece that complements what you're saying for me is, I'm in a mission-based organisation basically, but it turns out that everybody has a different understanding of what that mission is. Even though it's very clear, everybody in every office interprets it somewhat differently, and even the senior management team, you know, there's the 10 people who run the organisation at the highest level, right? They don't agree on, partly it's based on history, partly it's based on what department they run, all that kind of stuff. They don't actually fundamentally agree, you know, there might be a tagline, but when you go one level deeper, right? Or particularly when you look at how it actually touches other people, it's gone. So one of the big things we're trying to do with that is we've been really creating an open space for some of the history of those disagreements to come out. And that's been difficult, but it's been working with people in the senior management team and the retreats that they've been doing to basically put those questions on the agenda and find a way to surface them. And so one of the things I'm doing is working towards the Global Senior Management Retreat, which will be in Switzerland in July. And we're designing the agenda for that for 4 days, where every single head of office around the world comes in once every couple of years to try and get them in a state where they can come out of it understanding a bit better both the shared vision and the mission, but I really want to get them to the point where they can articulate who their users are. Or at least think that they have to go away and do that, so they have to do the user research. Because right now they internalize and they have habitualize what they do. They don't do the user research to say, do I really understand what people need from me? And I don't think they do. So we're trying to set up a bunch of sessions and exercises to break through that. Because I think when they're in the point that they recognize they don't actually quite understand what people need from them, then they can ask for, then they know they need to go through a process to figure that out. And that's the design process, if you like.
I mean, I feel like that's a really good question. It comes up all the time in my work. On one hand, there's the question of institutional readiness, but even before that, many people do, if you could sort of link what it is that design can offer in terms of, like he's saying, really advancing their objectives, for me that's sort of the first foot in the door. And I don't usually use words like design, because it turns out that people just think that means painting walls or making things look nice. But I think that's where it also comes down to outcomes. So for me, when I say technical strategy, that's what I mean. That how is it going to actually improve something that they already think they need to improve or want to improve? And if they don't realize they need to improve it,
we actually don't use the word design. We actually do design, but we're actually fortunate, I think, because we're known as an innovation campus. So actually, which is actually quite fortunate with the Obama administration because he likes innovation quite a bit. But it's like, but the reality is that people come to us first for innovation and then kind of get spoon-fed design through the process. So I think actually your terminology actually might shift, which I think, by the way, is a hard thing because I think of myself as a designer. I'm sure many of you in the room think of yourself as a designer first. It's hard not to lead with design because it actually feels like you're betraying something, and yet it actually is one of the ways that you actually kind of get through.
I think I've been in the fortunate position of we have a new boss. Well, the boss came on before I did, but still. And she's articulated very clearly that leadership and innovation are her two keywords at the moment, which is refreshing. So now she's trying to drag everybody with her. But they don't actually, I think there's a challenge as well, they don't actually understand what innovation means in this space. So, you know, is it just everybody trying something different? Clearly not. Right? We know better than that. So let's try to figure that out. But I actually came back to another thought, if I could, around, probably to both of you or either of you. One of the practices of design in terms of doing research about understanding your users and your needs and communicating that and using that to formulate your strategies and your ideation process. One of the strategies we had when I was working at Microsoft, I spent a lot of time in Afghanistan working on projects with NGOs, local and international there, was we curated this term called sort of inverse incubation. Because the traditional incubation model, I was just struck by this comment you said about having to live with this deep partnership piece. Because the traditional incubation model, particularly in the technology sector or the product design sector, is to go do a bit of study, retreat back to your comfortable den with your beautiful bouncy balls or whatever other people have an idea it exists like, right? And then come up with magic. And then present it, you know it, you do all those steps. I mean, I remember doing brain design that way and stuff. But in Afghanistan, what we had to do was say, actually, you can't tackle this remotely. You have to live with the problem. You have to actually innovate in the field. And more importantly, you've got to involve your subjects, if you like, your users, actually as the active participants in the design process. And that takes time. And certainly in Afghanistan, it's incredibly difficult. And it's the only way you're going to get results that actually fit. I just want to check that was the kind of thing you were talking about.
Yeah, no, I mean, it's like, I think that's exactly what it is. And it's like, and like I said again, that's another, since Chamber asked to share challenges, it's just a huge challenge because, I mean, you risk a bunch of things. You risk internal culture, you risk a bunch of, you risk exhausting people if you actually kind of having them engage that deeply. And yet, for the kinds of things you want to affect, you probably have to do it that way. Can I ask a question to you? Because you talked at the very end about kind of collaborating with designers, and I was thinking, like, so what are you looking to them for? I mean, like, as you work with them, like, what do you expect them to bring to the table, or how are you using designers?
Yes, that's very close partners. So, and that's like sort of this hybrid of even conceptualizing projects. Let's say I work with Adolescent Health Center at Mount Sinai, and I have a background in adolescent health, so I know that one of the major issues in adolescent health, once they even access a clinic, for them to improve their outcomes, disclosure, for them to feel comfortable, be able to, you could give someone a full sexual history exam, but if they don't answer any questions, it's not really help you. And so I started and I know that's a major barrier, that's a major issue in health. We don't know how to do that, we don't know how to create safe spaces, and so I thought, why don't we think about what that experience is like for an adolescent? We worked with Smart Design, and they came up with sort of the emotional journey for adolescents of the clinic. And so while I sort of start conceptualizing things, I then select design partners who I, first of all, want to work with me and or who I think could help me with that specific task. But pretty clear, like, what are the objectives, which I would work with the organization to then define. Okay, they've got lots of challenges, but knowing adolescent health, I might suggest, these are some different areas you might want to consider. Let's work with a design group. And I think that's the kind of process stuff I'm still trying to hammer out. And so there's lots of opportunities, but some of the challenges, again, are this kind of, on one hand, I'm also putting myself out on a limb because I'm not a designer, and so I have ideas of how I think design could apply to what, I have a deep understanding, probably know the problem, then, you know, designers have to kind of deliver. And so that's where I also ask these questions in real world contexts. You know, it all sounds great, and let's say that, you know, Gates gives me some funding, I have to then show how design has ended up influencing the process. And even donors aside, for me, yeah, obviously the design can influence health outcomes, but we're still trying to understand how that is true. And so I think for me, it's just also setting up realistic parameters of, okay, we're talking about a user experience, and before we can start talking about, you know, how a user experience of a clinic has then reduced, you know, sexual violence or improved disclosure, what are even sort of incremental progress? What would be incremental progress? And how would we measure that? How would we know that? How would we know if something's working? But yeah.
I think, and Jamie, you referred to this, I mean, I think that's actually, it is a really interesting challenge for this program, or frankly, any future-facing, I think, design program, which is like, I think to think about how we actually measure the metrics that are in place. I mean, frankly, I also think it's an opportunity for public health and government to rethink their metrics as well, because actually I would say metrics are universally broken, and more broken for design and other places. But I do think there's actually a huge opportunity, I think, especially when you're looking at interdisciplinary work, when you're thinking about design and, you know, public health, and that to think about what are the new kinds of metrics that we might develop together, that feel actually more appropriate to where we are today.
I think that's probably actually one of the advantages, or one of the things you open up space for, if you take a design kind of approach, a service design approach, or whatever approach you have, because once you start focusing on, if you step back and start saying, what are you trying to deliver, what change are you trying to impact, you're having to rethink the focus on the end users and understand them again, if you like, because it might have been done in the past. I think that's a great place to inject those questions out. Well, how will we know then if we've made a better outcome for you? Build the measurement into the process. And I don't think you get that by decoupling the two.
I think from my perspective, I think both things will be strengthened, or that's what I'm sort of seeing happen as we collaborate. So I think that design is strengthened in terms of being able to clearly articulate what populations are we trying to work with. Oh, it's not clients, it's actually the providers or the coordinators. And that on the program sort of side, I think the role of innovation, disruptive thinking in specific areas of programming. I think that's the other risk here, is that everything, I'm not saying everything's not at programs, but I think there are things that are working that could be leveraged, and I think things like evidence-based decision making should remain in place. And so things like, you know, where there is rigorous research, where there is knowledge, that's a big thing that I always say to designers that I work with, of let me tell you what best practices are and what already works, and we don't need to reinvent that, and maybe things can be improved upon, but there are huge gaps in areas in which we really need people to disrupt thinking. So I think being able to make those kinds of distinctions is important.
I'm intrigued by, I mean, both of you coming from slightly different perspectives on this. I mean, I like the ex-designer comment you made there, and seeing various students come through, it's, you know, it's clearly where we need to be going. I find myself in this interesting position of, I mean, I've worked as a designer a small amount, I'll say. I've got a small amount of training in it. Most of my work has been in other areas. But a lot of my work over the past, I've done some design work, making graphic outputs, etc., if you like, the traditional design work. But a lot of what I do is I act as a critic. I mean, that traditional role of being basically critiquing, teaching people who work for me, or just doing the review cycle over and over again to do learning and so forth. And clearly that requires design thinking of some sense. I'm talking about myself here, but one of the challenges I see is when you start embracing new partners, you start doing co-teaching, you start teaching design, you start getting involved from both sides, is I think the word design sometimes sits, or being a designer sometimes sits as a barrier in between those things. Clearly I'm biased, because I sort of teeter or sit on the non-designer side. But I wonder how you find that in your recruiting or partnering, because clearly you're going to have people, you say you want deep designers who have another deep skill, but that's it's a pretty rare thing, and B, you know, what's teachable?
I think it's actually, there's two things I actually say, which is that what I think is really interesting is I think what we're kind of dancing around here is a connotation of design that I think actually might be archaic. Like I think we think of designers when we have bad experiences with them as being irresponsible of context, kind of individually driven, focused on kind of like their personal kind of aesthetics over the real context that actually that they might be living in. So I actually think that one of the things we need to do is kind of tidy up the way the kind of the assumptions that we carry around design perceptions, because I think that's actually what you grapple with. What I think is interesting is you talked about, so you might be X-shaped with like your design part's a little smaller, whatever. Whatever. The other bit is larger, but the thing is that actually what's interesting to me is thinking about the three designers who work for you, and as they work for you, their X, I think, will be quite well developed in the sense that it's like they're designers, but they're actually working in your organization, understanding it firsthand of the problems, which means that by and large, they will be the X-shaped designers that we actually are looking for. And so I do think the role of real experience to kind of engaging a lot of our X-shaped designers, we're having to train them by saying you're going to live in government context for now on because that's actually what we need to do. And so I think that you'll be growing, frankly.
Yeah, I think probably one of the things I was trying to get at there was that I think there's the part of what you were grappling with about the definition of what is a designer is there's the T part, the deep design skills, the production skills, and whatever discipline you're working in. But if I look at what we're doing, and who's here from the course we just ran, which was very much a strategic design course, the Designing with the Red Cross, a huge amount of that is actually around the critique and the strategy formulation and communications piece. And I see that as being the thing that doesn't fit the traditional definition of designer, but is actually the most critical piece about making sure you're getting outcomes and you ask the right questions. And some people have it from the school, clearly have it, who aren't design educated. One of the things we have from the design education, or we're changing design education to provide more, I think is a process for doing that consistently, and it's always been part of individual disciplines, but I think we're now abstracting that.
Is Joe got the beginning? I'm going to jump into the first moment of awkward silence, but and just kind of have these. I'm working on it. No, Mrs. Chris. I need this. And one thing that I can say is that one of the few nice things about having to come and present somewhere is that you think, oh, give a presentation. That's kind of, I know how to do that, and then I just sit down and answer some questions. I don't have to really prepare or really think, I just have to react. I appreciate the three of you actually having to, on the spot come up with questions for each other, and it was really gratifying to see the results of that. Much more interesting than if I had been asking some questions. But I'm going to take the privilege of asking just a couple of questions that have been bugging me, and you all three can have a whack at them. The first is just, I'd be interested in all three of your context from your experience of what is design competing with in these institutional contexts that you're working. In other words, what are that? We seem to think we know what design is. I don't know if we do, but we think we do. But what's it competing with? What are the other practices from your experience that design has to push out of the way in order to be considered, in order to be part of the game? Because I think it'd be interesting to take that inventory in a sense and say, well, we from the inside know design, and it has, we think it has a place, but what does it have to displace in order to get there? What are the competing practices, and how? I mean, not that it's a zero-sum game, but how do you start to understand strategically what the landscape is in order that you can be more effective within that landscape?
I think inertia is one thing that has to be displaced. And I mean, I think we were sort of talking about this sort of institutional culture, but whenever I'm sort of approaching institutions which largely have not the first thing that comes up is funding, that they're, it just has to displace the other stuff that they do. So often I'm working with organizations that I've already worked with, like hat, so I'm able to say, well, what if what you're already doing is not as
bureaucracies, if you like, maybe even small bureaucracies. And I've done, work with Microsoft and the military and others. Pick a couple of big bureaucracies in the UN now. I've also worked on startups. It's not all been big bad things. The bureaucratic culture itself has a process, and it has a policy formulation and distribution and compliance process that is in the UN it's claimed it's the worst practices of the mid-50s Algerian bureaucrats is how it was designed. It's not like that completely anymore, but in all of these large bureaucracies there is a way of doing things, if you like, and it usually comes down as a committee that formulates policy, has a review cycle of some kind, produces a document, and then distributes it. And usually it kind of ends there. And so there's massive gaping spaces actually still waiting to be filled even within that process while retaining it. I think that's really often the case. People don't recognise that there might be some notional sense about how change happens, or how policy is implemented, but usually the lack of compliance in the space is so huge, and everybody recognises that. So I think there's surprisingly more space than we think if we figure out how to tell the story right about what's on offer.
I'll just add, I'll be more abstract and then really practical on it. But it's like, I would actually agree it's like the way of doing things. It's kind of like a legacy, and with that actually it's the people who do those things, and it's the legacy of who's always done those things. And frankly, those are often kind of in consultancy. It's like we need to develop a whole new process, a new system. Let's go back to the same
Go to
people.
Booz or go to
And so literally, and it's funny, I love this at Social Security, which is that the commissioner himself talks about, so they won't use the word design either, but he talks about idealizing things, which is great for us, which is like, but what I think is really interesting is that as we were doing the research, we saw 10 of the same projects done by the same consultant coming through, and like literally, I think it's like, you could see like, the problem had come up, they went back to the same people, they probably got the same document, and they just kind of stacked, and because of the ways organizations that work, you can lose track of it, it gets lost in the organization. So it's not just the ways, it's the who's. I think that's one of the things that we can do is be fresh in the ways that we're doing things and with a fresh who as well, which can break through some of this stuff as well.
And I think you've got an opportunity, whether you're inside or outside or doing a bit of both, it's a typical management consultant thing in a way, but perhaps it's a part of the design strategies too, is to go back and look at those previous attempts. You do want to start fresh, you want to open up the conversation, but it's also important to ask that question about why have the 5 previous attempts to change this failed? Because that's your first bridge, first piece of wall you need to knock down and say, we can't just do the same thing again. You can't just hire the same consultant or do the same process. You have to try something different. So what's going to do?
Which it seems to me is actually what you're kind of asking. That's like the kind of question of what you're talking about, which is that this is failing over and over again. So why? And shouldn't we be applying different?
Yeah, and I mean, I think that the institutional readiness piece is something I always consider before I start working with partners, because I feel like, especially in the beginning, on one hand, yes, we're prepared to fail early and that, but it's just that I feel like there's this window where people are kind of excited and there's momentum, and you also need to deliver some stuff, so that people will brush that off.
How do you determine, and this is a question I'll throw to you, how do you determine institutional readiness? Is it the conversation with the CEO? Is it
matrix and a calculation?
12-point scoring system, yeah.
I mean, yeah, you just get it. Well, I mean, honestly, so the main thing is, my father was a physician, so he's always like, where do you have money to do this? Healthcare is failing, and and I say I only work with people who actually are trying to start and strive for excellence. So I don't really, if you feel like you know you're doing better than you're doing, you may be feeling maybe you're not, then maybe I'm not the person to work with. But it's harder and harder to make the argument without that things are just great. So hopefully if you're an organization where your mission is to change health outcomes, you want to try something that's going to help you that.
Yeah, I would agree. There's 2 things I would say. I think that we see that people come to us when things are breaking, which is actually, and actually we're in a funny place where a lot of things are breaking. And in some cases they're breaking because the outcomes aren't what we actually expect them to be, or they're actually, and so I think is what you described for example. I will say one thing that I think is actually really important for designers who are coming into their own now is actually to recognize one of the big forcing functions for things breaking now, which is actually new technology. everything has to shift, and is shifting now, and has to shift rapidly to kind of catch up with the fact that we don't do anything the same way we used to do. And so what I would say is 70% of the clients who are basically saying, well, we have to suddenly rethink this whole thing because we didn't expect that technology would be putting us out of business or changing the potential for outcomes or whatever in a huge way. So help us think about it. So I would say as a foundation, digital platforms is actually a really significant piece of what we can be thinking about.
I'd probably reinforce that in some ways.
I
That's actually a strategy for
Yeah.
causing people to open the door when they were closed before. Is the existential and external threat? Even if UN's going to keep getting funded, for instance, but what do you need to do to get the chink open to make it worth your while? I mean, for me, to make the choice to go into the UN and recognise that was there. I mean, I've also got another venture that's starting up at the moment on the side that is in this humanitarian information space, but is a completely different kind of venture, which is new technology based on partnership based and field based. And it's great because that's actually the threat that's coming, whether it's by me or just an advisor or whatever, is actually a big lever on the traditional organisation. So I can say, you can imagine what this is going to be like. And there are great stories being told by people, I think in every space, about what the possible futures are. And finding those is actually really powerful. So one meme that I've been using for years to try and basically club various people to change their behaviour in the humanitarian space is, in 2005 when I was in the Sudan, probably the last time I was in the Sudan, the head of the UN, they got a text message from a woman in a refugee in an IDP camp in Darfur. I didn't get the plastic sheeting I was promised. So, just now it's a much more common place. We had a lot of stories after Haiti, and I was down there and I'm involved with the whole community. But that just suddenly scares the bejesus out of those people, because it is the signal of the sea change that's coming. Right? And they think about it for 5 minutes and they know they can't stop it. So what do they do in response?
Everyone can pre-decide when we sell some liquor around. All right. Just trying to set a bad example. Why don't I'd be curious questions that you all may have.
You mentioned technology having a determining factor as to perhaps dictating a direction, but what I'm also hearing is language as being a huge influence, and so I wonder, the narrative that you craft for yourself in given situations, what leverage does that have? I mean, in certain instances, there was the case where you don't consider yourself a designer specifically for this audience, but you're designing, correct? And so
I guess it actually has to come from, so language is how we express the culture. Each culture expresses it through the words they choose and the identity forms around how you describe yourself and so forth. So I think it's actually about the stance you take. Because whether you take an insider stance or an outsider stance, there's some change agents in between, they're tactical choices. Right? So sometimes you want to be the outsider because that's the only way that you're going to be the irritant to cause change. And sometimes you have to be the insider. And I think that really determines the language you end up having to choose.
Yeah, I have a couple ways of reading your question. So so one is like the way you label yourself as in order to kind of actually engage in certain things, to actually kind of have the seat at the table, and that I think you might have to shift. I think, but I actually I'll throw out a provocation, I guess, to you and to everyone here, which is that actually I think one of the biggest kind of challenges to interdisciplinarity is actually specialized language. So the notion that you speak in one way and you speak in another way and you speak in another way because you have to, because the context that you're in actually doesn't allow you to speak very well together. So you basically say, well, nobody really understands each other. I actually think it's an obligation in interdisciplinarity to actually think about how we actually speak in the simplest, most basic language that we can all talk in so that we can actually even begin to engage. I actually think my question here is a leading question because I think design, visual design, when you do it, is a language and it's actually one that you can react to immediately. So often what you give is somebody's going to say, oh, we could never do a grocery store like that. It's like that would never work, but if we did this, this, and this, I could imagine it. It's actually a very tangible, visceral way of kind of breaking through language. So I think in the absence of speaking clearly with each other, I think design can often be used as a kind of another tool there, I think.
I actually think public health is an interesting space because certainly working with public health officials in different contexts, in emergencies particularly, it's both the expertise that comes with being a doctor, or the credentials, if you like. The language itself is used exclusionary. It's to exclude someone from actually having a voice in a conversation that maybe should be more open. I've got a great quote from Murray Gell-Mann, who was the renowned physicist and Nobel Prize winner and so forth, doing most complex things. He once said to me, "You'd rather use someone else's toothbrush than their notation," right? Which is, it's the sort of basically, I need to use the tools I want to do to get things done. It's the opposite of trying to be collaborative. Yeah.
It's funny. I mean, I feel like I also have several reactions to it, but for me, I feel like we could have a whole symposium just on language because it's a deep question about culture, like you're saying, and and about communications. It's like, okay, well, I mean, I often feel this with my designer friends that I'm working with and collaborating with. Is then, you know, I want to have sort of more graphic, representation because that's exactly why I want to work with designers, is to be able to communicate these things to different fields. And yet, then on the other side of the table, you know, I have my like metrics and stuff. And so, then what is the fluidity? And so what I'm learning is that it's turning out where we're teaching each other. So in a similar, you know, it's like literally learning a foreign language, which that's another piece of it too, is especially in international settings, I feel that if designers are going to start working and become tailor their services and skills, I think that literally learning languages is important because that's something in public health that we now we're required to speak the local language and the right to medical systems. And I think that so there's that aspect of language and culture. There's then how we collaborating with each other, but I think that teaching each other. I mean, I think literally I have a design firm that has asked me to make a glossary of terms that I use all the time, thinking people understand what I'm saying.
Well, and I just want to jump on because I think I agree. I think our whole symposium on language is fascinating, and I think that there's a necessity for cultures to have their own language. It means it breeds efficiency, right? So actually you're able to speak quicker to each other. And then, but I do think noticing when that's actually an obstruction. The classic example is a design example. Is I was an architecture graduate student, and I remember, and I responded terribly to it. Like left architecture after working a year, was like, this is no offense, architecture, this is this awful place to be. Went to IDEO, and then built an architecture practice at IDEO, which is kind of stupid. But it's like, and it was hiring architects, and I remember like sitting, and it was kind of dawned on me, like with a young student who came through, and she was talking about this interstitial space. She was like, and there's this interstitial space that happens here, and there's this kind of intervention that happens here around this interstitial space, and I'm like, I'm pretty much sure you're talking about a corridor. Like, can we just, or a hallway, if that's actually easier. And it's like, but the reality is that we do it all the time. I mean, and
she didn't use the word liminal space as well.
And then in academia, we doubly do it, you know? So it's like, but I mean, I think, and there's appropriate moments for that, and there's really appropriate moments to challenge that. And it's the same thing, I think, in the ways that we're working across all kinds of aspects of this.
But I think I was struck by your comment about the visual language as well, because it's something that designers pretty much all share, no matter where they come from. There's the ability to express yourself visually. Right? It might be more polished or less polished or whatever, but it's a visual thinking that we're communicating, we're talking about in many cases. So one of the things I found really powerful is trying to get out of the sense of, particularly in organizational cultures, is to get out of the sense of someone going away and making a finished product. So the whole role of sketching is what I'm talking about. So we talk about sketching as a design process, a tool for rapidly generating ideas and so forth, but it's also a way to rapidly communicate those together. So to get away from the finished product, from the draft that is actually a big document that's ready or a plan, to actually have something that's rougher, and preferably something that's visual as well. But and that's the great thing about the visual sketch, is that it forces you to get away from the polished piece of language that we require professionally. That's usually the entrance exam to these professions. And I think it has a real powerful piece to get it to that place.
Yeah, and like his question, because I had two different ones, which you help me choose which one. The easy follow-up to that, which I first read 6 years ago, and the thing I took away from that I've never forgotten was the issue about language, but at that time he was working with an anthropologist, and what struck me was both how they neutralised their language interesting in the context of today's reviews as well, because I think, and we were yesterday, we had from Denmark had done a workshop which was also touched on storytelling, and then some people tried to really use their presentations today to sort of play with the idea of storytelling. And the question was asked yesterday about whether storytelling was something that should be part of design education. And I just think it's an interesting, because I feel like I've heard that said at least for 5 or 6 years, and yet I think that the people that took the riskier moves today of trying to use storytelling in their thing also get critiqued for what they don't do because they do storytelling instead. So I guess this is partly directed at people. I mean, I think IDEO has clearly made a claim to tell a good story. If there's stuff left out, story is what people will remember, and that's exactly my experience of always watching you present, is that takeaway that's not the detail of what you say, but your ability to tell that story. So
I'll give you a really personal experience that I had. So CFPB, Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, again, I think I said in the beginning, like I spend my life pretty much in terror. Like I can't believe I'm in the context that we're in. So we're designing an agency, and this is Elizabeth Warren's agency. She's incredibly well versed in what she believes are the big issues, the financial issues with the American citizenry. And we had to present to her organization what we believe consumers are actually going to believe about a government agency going in and fixing their own finances. And we got incredibly, just baseline things, like the fact is that Americans think of debt and cash in the same way. So actually nobody thinks about cash and debt the same way. Things that it's like people don't talk about money, they'll talk about weight or sex, or they'll talk about money. They don't talk about money because shame is kind of embedded in it. And so all these things are actually counter to the things that actually Elizabeth Warren and the organization are building their whole institution around. I literally, with stories, I watched them get blown back into their seat. And then we went out to dinner with clients afterwards, and they were like, I realized I'm in massive financial trouble. And what they realized, the top people, which by the way, everyone at IDEO had realized 2 weeks earlier when we heard the stories, we're like, oh my God, that's me. I totally make this kind of mistake. But the power of a story to actually build empathy and basically say, wait a second, this is totally right, and everything else falls into place afterwards. And so actually, I would say, I think it'd be an interesting thing. Obviously with what you're managing in your critiques, you're managing a range of things, and that you're kind of critiquing for.
Exactly.
But when you just do story, it allows you to say, well, are we telling a good story? And then you can imagine other things that you're critiquing.
I guess so that's what I was meaning is how do you really teach storytelling and deconstruct it? You have to practice it, right, to see what makes a good story and stuff. And that was part of what I think it also would be.
I think it also comes down to using it as a strategy, though, as well internally, because it's a research strategy, etc. But it's also about part of the culture change strategy.
Yeah, I agree.
And I think you need to. I think there's very particular ways you can elicit stories and use them that having an understanding of what storytelling is and when it makes a difference is really important for. So, for instance, one of the guys I work very closely with is a former TV ad producer. He knows how to tell a pretty impactful story, and he does the video stuff for us. But what he and I work together all the time on a bunch of internal stories. So, we talked about a lot of agencies, for instance, are about advocacy using stories. They go out and they collect stories to retell them to raise money or whatever. What we're doing at the moment is actually just put in place a competition. The email went out today to all staff to tell stories about what they do. It's around innovation, but the main goal is actually, sure, innovation is important, we're using it as the thread, but it's actually to get a conversation going between different people in the organisation so they recognise what it is that they do. Right? And I think it's only the first step, but that internal storytelling about building this culture of recognising what it is we do, what we don't do, etc., they won't have that critique until it's there. So we're going to have this great session, I think, at the Global Retreat, where we're going to run through a bunch of these. And I'm trying to figure out what kind of discussion we have around them, but yeah, it's going to be fun.
And I was thinking about it in the context of being in this building. I went to Lane Cafe, which was one either 6 years ago, but they waiting for someone, and there was someone from the MFA in creative writing, like a professor meeting with a student. And it was funny just listening to how incredibly versed that professor was at critiquing the students' language of play. But, in the same way that we would obviously be able to critique design, but it's like that ability to critique what's happening in the narrative is just so intensely expert.
But I think
where storytelling,
No, just-
and-
Later.
you know, in the absence of information data,
Yeah.
I was in a situation where I brought the Bolivian executive director of International Planned Parenthood to the U.S. to talk to design firms, and he will probably be the next Minister of Health in Bolivia, and to have designers sort of say to him, like tell him simple stories about how they could change health in Bolivia. I mean, I think later on he was like, are they kidding? Like, how is this grounded in context, or, you know, and for me, I mean, that moment was an opportunity for them, because obviously my role was to talk about how design can.
Yeah, and I think what we're talking about when we're looking at stories, actually, I think they're human-centered stories. So I think that the way that we look at it is actually telling a real human story. I think the power of a human story actually is that when it's right, it's undeniably right. Actually, you can see it in like your core in deep ways. And so I think it's a little different than telling a story about a design or how design might have an impact for a fabricated story around a person. And I'll also say that, and this is a perspective that not everyone's a good storyteller.
Yeah.
You know, there's a great story that could, and we've seen it, that's been butchered by a bad storyteller. So it's like, I mean, the reality is that you have to kind of balance that a little bit, and then the ways that you think about it.
Well, I think it was funny during the last presidential election, and it was like everyone trying to copy us out and say, it's a human story by every politician.
Yeah, exactly.
So one of the things where I'm working on with this guy, David, the filmmaker, for us, is in this Sudan thing I'm talking about. I know that we've got a couple of, for instance, national GIS officers, so local GIS officers, who are deeply technical geodesing, making maps like the one I showed you. And part of the goal of being there is going to be retraining and rethinking what they're going to be doing. And so it's to force them to think about these design questions when they're making their work. Right? And it's hard because they don't see themselves, they see themselves as technicians fulfilling a job. But one of the things I really want to try and do, if we can, is to bring David along and capture that transition in some sense. Because I'd love him to produce a piece of work that tells someone's journey around making this change in thinking, making this change in product. You know, we could get as flashy as we like saying bad maps end up in good maps. But I think the human side of that story is actually been much more compelling about the difficulties of change and things like that. And that's the piece we use to generate change in other places. Because we've seen over and over again the manual on how to do things differently will not do that change.
Hi, it's great to be here with you guys. One of the things
You're like right here. You're right.
Cameron's like, move
Well,
up.
I think we need to
Move up. So, the thing that's been interesting being in this program for the last 4 years with the design management students is that and it's obviously started probably a decade ago or more, where trying to speak the language of business and designers speaking to learn how to speak the language of business, and business people try to learn how to speak the language of design, seem to be the first baby step, I would say, for us to even have this conversation, and for you to be for all of you to be doing what you're doing, working with designers and governments and things like that. But the thing that I find interesting is that that whether or not, I sort of lost my train of thought. It's so powerful. I was like reminiscing on like the history of the evolution of design, the planet.
I was thinking about like when I first came to, because it was like in the school of design management, which I think was actually really interesting. The first lecture I gave was actually at Parsons of Design Management, because it's I think it was actually about the question of how design speaks to business.
Yeah, and I think this is it.
I was totally buying time.
So unless there's a bottom line to prove that there's quantifiable information about something improving financially in some endeavor, right? Then there's really no incentive for a majority of the planet to sort of make a shift. And also, unless there's a major catastrophe, war, nuclear attack, disease, tsunami, whatever it is, we don't change. So the thing that I was
Often there we don't change either.
yeah, the thing that I'm most interested in is who and where do we see the opportunity where a proactive point of view might take place, where we don't wait for the disaster to occur, but we actually have an entire organization built around foreseeing potential problems. And that's more interesting to me. I mean, because it's all about catch up now. Always catching up, always. And I think it's going to take a major shift in policy and in government and to embrace like a whole different way of looking at other ways of dealing with these things.
Some of the questions you're asking came up. I mean, I think that there's so many different questions in there, but some of them, the questions of ROI and what influences policy decision making, sort of at heart, I think. And sort of with Marlon Rutner, who I don't think is here, we ran a, he's possibly coming back from Geneva as we speak, because we ran a course last semester with the UN ISDR, Institute for Disaster Risk Reduction, about the global report that happens every 2 years, the Global Risk Report. And that was a mixture of strategy and tactics about it, but one of the really important things about it was that they were coming to a vision of what the purpose of this was. So why are we putting this out there? And the stated intent was to give policymakers better tools for making decisions about reducing risks and preventing catastrophes and so forth, but more importantly, preventing the impact and the flow on, and so building resilient communities. They're trying to say that there are tools, there are metrics for saying what the return on investment might be. They might be rough, but they're there. So we've got a bunch of stuff here. But they were saying it in a really appalling way, let me be blunt, in terms of communicating it. It's the typical scientific, lay it out there and they will understand deep charts and so forth. And so one of the important things was to get to the space where we said it's not just the facts that matter. It is the storytelling, it is the emotional connection that you form, it's the accessibility of the information, all of which are just design questions ultimately, which at least are questions that design can help answer or help provide solutions for. And that was a big eye-opener for them, but it was really also really constructive to see that we had a role to play and students had a role to play in, we redesigned the entire report. There are animations and infographics that support those arguments now and games that they're playing at this global conference that are an outcome of saying, let's ask a different set of questions about why this is there. So I think it's actually really important to allow the agency of design in this space.
And I think I feel like people are asking this question of, okay, at least I'm certainly asking the question, within public health, I mean, we are trying to prevent things, as you're saying, well, now it's like we've gotten so far deep into our situation. That's great that you want to prevent obesity now, but then also, for example, the supermarket idea, my hope is not just that it will contribute to obesity prevention, but that we start asking ourselves questions about, well, what is health and well-being? What are resilient communities? Like, how are these opportunities not just to prevent illness and death and talk in terms of mortality and morbidity, but what would that be? How can we talk about it and develop new language around it and all that? So I think that's an important question, and I think design has a big role to play.
I think the return on investment question is a really hard one, though. I mean, for all kinds of interventions. I mean, design has a real challenge saying, how do you quantify the outcomes? It's this measurable question you were asking from the beginning. And the big social change scale, we really, it's hard. Economists work for dozens of years and whole careers trying to prove that one thing is more than another, and some cohorts 3 years later it shows them otherwise. So I don't know how we grapple with it.
Yeah, I mean, I sort of two thoughts. I mean, one is actually I was thinking about, as I was watching your presentation and as we're talking about this, I think there's a really interesting story you told about the power of a bad map. So what happens when you do a bad map? I don't know, but I can imagine it could have devastating consequences in the and I think for instance, I think that's an ROI story, really. I mean, if you think about it, it's basically saying bad map could equal misdirecting of resources, or could and with that
Which is the waste of resources, because no one wants that.
Exactly. It's like, and so I think that there are interesting other kinds of ROI stories that we could actually tease out. And I think that that's actually our job. And then I think it kind of goes to, I'm thinking about the most right now with the practice, which is I think increasingly we're thinking like, and I said this, it's like if we're waiting for people to come to us, we're not going to be able to solve the big problems, we're going to be able to solve the problems that people come to us for. So when know we have to leapfrog. We know we have to go to the places where we actually think solutions can happen.
Be more proactive.
Right, and then we have to figure out how we tell the story that actually lets us get in the door. And I think actually that's great work for us to be doing. And it's like, because it actually makes us kind of tell stories around the value and ROI of the work that we do to actually get us into the doors and around those conversations. And it's future casting. It's like saying, here's what will happen if we don't do this. So, but I think increasingly that's actually where we have to go. I think other parts of, speaking frankly as a design consultant, everything else is commoditized. So that actually, I mean, frankly, and speaking purely financially, it's like the money isn't there unless we actually go to big problems. So we have to get good at kind of tackling that.
But I
That
think
sounds really probably
there's,
horrible, but it's true.
I think
We get to touch the human spirit, and that's what the
Yeah.
story about the Olympics. Anyone who's about to perform and go on the pole vault or whatever, there's a story behind it, and we get empathetic and we care about that person that's about to go and do their thing, and we start to cry, whether it's American Idol or the Olympics or whatever. There's some story being told to catch us in our heart. And
And that's like as old as human
It's an old story.
It's like we've always done that. So it's like, it's like we should be as good as everybody else in the world is at least, So it's, I think it's a really interesting topic.
Did you ask a question? Sorry, you asked a question about the need for showing return on investment to get the commercial world particularly to adopt things and to force these different changes. And certainly, if you step it up to the bigger picture social changes we think are needed, then that's a real hassle about it's your scale in the time of your group. I also think that there's a lot more opportunities than we usually give it credit for in terms of different business models and new kinds of funding and all this kind of stuff. So I think there's a lot of traditional thinking about how to do startups, to do businesses, to institute change through big governments. And I've been quite surprised for this other venture I've been helping get off the ground. We've opened so many new sources of funding and money that I never even thought would exist for a social enterprise, not even a for-profit return. And I'm kind of shocked by how, it's been hard, but how the pitch around this kind of changes has a bunch of different resonances. Gates Foundation and other groups are actually new. At the scale they're at and the way they're operating, they're only less than 10 years old, basically.
Yeah.
So there's a lot of different innovation happening in that space. I think it's kind of interesting that we haven't figured out how to tell the story or how to grapple with it or where to take it.
Is it a quick question?
The question's great. Can you tell us more about the
It's a yes/no question.
the nonprofit IDEO.org and maybe that?
So I can say no, so that I can we have, just to be honest, and this is one of the things that we actually got with, which at some point we realized that actually to really work in the scales we wanted to in the nonprofit sector, we actually really couldn't be for profit. We couldn't. So we actually have some work that we do, like we do work with Rockefeller, that's actually strategy work, that's actually part of the for-profit piece of IDEO. But when we wanted to hit the nonprofit scale, we had to actually rethink our financial structure entirely. And so a lot of the work, including all this, of the last 3 years has been to build a strategy around launching.org, which we did. Filed our papers 2 months ago. We'll actually will be officially at .org in September 7th. And we'll have our first class of fellows, IDEO fellows and outside fellows coming through together to work on global problems. Pretty cool problems are already coming through the door. So we're really quite excited. It's pretty cool. So, and yeah, tell people to apply for a fellowship next year. It's been really interesting to see who's coming through.
Okay, a quick thanks to Abira, Francis, and Jackie for leading this precious conversation and going out and doing the dirty work, fetching the beer and the alcohol, but most of all to Rupal and to Nigel and to Fred. Great conversation. Your candor was really appreciated. None of this stuff is altogether nearly as easy as it's sometimes portrayed. So I think it really helps us as we struggle through some of these same kinds of issues to get the kind of unvarnished truth. So thank you all. And the festival continues, so all of you, please, there's lots of events going on day and night across Parsons, so do avail yourself of that. And if you're interested, just one small plug, on Monday afternoon at 2 o'clock, Dominic Murin will be coming to speak in the Transdisciplinary Studio in 601 2 West 13th Street on his talk called Humble Factor in Thinking Globally, Producing Locally. And Dominic is a Global TED Fellow, really interesting, trying to really reinvent how we make things, and that involves how we grow things as well. So I encourage you to come to that if you're interested. But thanks to our presenters, most of all. We probably don't have a can opener, a bottle opener. I was partway through this whole thing, I thought, oh no, a bottle opener. Yeah, I know, I was too Nigel. Good, thank you.